Think of the last time you saw a teenager carrying a speaker around, blasting their music out into the open. Now, what if, instead of some rowdy teenager, it was a pair of esteemed soundscape researchers who are lugging a sound system into your local park? Well, we're speaking to those researchers today, and we'll be sure to tell them to turn it down! Hello, and welcome to The Rest is Just Noise, a monthly podcast all about the science, beauty, and noise of our cities. I'm Andrew. I'm an acoustician and a soundscape researcher, joined by my co-hosts.
I'm Francisco. I'm an architect and a soundscape researcher.
I'm Tin. I'm an architect and an urban planner and a soundscape researcher.
Today, we're speaking with Dr. Dan Steele and Dr. Edda Bild, researchers from McGill University, about their work on practical soundscape interventions and what public space soundscapes can be. Musikiosk was a small soundscape intervention where users of a small public park in Montreal were encouraged to plug their phones into a sound system that Dan and Edda had set up and play the music of their choice. Dan and Edda walk us through how the community engaged with Musikiosk and what challenges they faced to do the thing. I'm sure there's more in this extended conversation, but as Dan says, it's always the 5-year-old projects he can't seem to get away from, so we're going to force them to relive it some more. The rest is just noise. And Edda for joining us. How are you guys doing? No, absolutely no response.
Is the silence done?
Should we try that again? This is what happens when we have any silence on this show whatsoever. Everyone gets completely flustered. All right, attempt number 2. Hiya, Dan. Hiya, Edda. Thanks very much for joining us. How are you guys doing?
Hi, we're doing
Hi.
great. Thank you
Hi.
for inviting us here. Everything's working so seamlessly so far. This is great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Oh, we're glad you could join us. Yeah, we have a pattern of technical issues that we don't let the audience in to know about.
They don't need to.
So we're going to get into quite a lot of things. We're particularly focusing on your project, Musikiosk, which is super interesting. But before we get into all of that, I want to start with a question that we ask everybody who comes on, which is just that everybody in acoustics seems to come into it with a wide range of backgrounds and through a different path. So Edda, first, how did you get into studying sound? Where did you start and sort of what path did you take?
Well, I definitely did not get into acoustics per se. That is still a field that remains a tad unknown to me, and I am still flustered every time someone asks me something related to acoustic aspects. I have a background in social sciences. I'm a sociologist and a political scientist in training, and I sort of got into sound considerations when I was desperately looking for a job after graduating from migration studies. And someone offered me a job at a sensor technology institute, and they wanted to work with sound. And they're like, "Well, you're a sociologist. Maybe you can help us with some of our methodologies. We're trying to observe sound in the wild." I completely had no idea what that meant. But yes, so apparently sound has entered my life as a field of study because of economic constraints, and.
So we are basically saying the job market for acousticians is better than for political scientists and social scientists in general.
I would never dare.
Okay.
I would say that, no, what I would say is saying that there is a lot of awareness on the fact that acousticians and sound-related studies do require people that have a social sciences background rather than just engineers who think that just because they're people, they know how people think. So I was the right person at the right time at the right presentation, and they offered me a job, and then they offered me a PhD, and I was like, okay. So again, I am now in soundscape studies because of a long string of, okay, well, will you pay me?
I think that actually seems to be relatively common.
I mean, I do like it, but it's also, if I wasn't paid for it, I don't know if I would do it. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
You mentioned like the recognition that you need someone who actually kind of understands how people think about things as opposed to just engineers. Do you think that's like a modern, recent thing? Or if we'd gone back, 40 years, would they have had that same sort of approach?
No. I'm a woman, so 40 years ago, no one would have really taken me seriously as a researcher. And B, definitely, I think that 40 years ago, this field was so, especially when it comes to urban spaces and outdoor spaces and everything, was so underdeveloped and so new that I don't know exactly where they would have positioned themselves. But if you look at Schaefer, also he comes from a humanities background, so maybe from the beginnings of the soundscape field per se, maybe that would have been where a sociologist or a ethnographer or something would have fit. But then in relation to acoustics itself, definitely not. I think this is a recent trend, and we're still butting heads with a lot of people ideologically on what comes first, the decibel or the perception of the decibel.
Oh, well, we clearly have an opinion on that on this podcast.
Do you want to share it or?
Oh,
No.
it's screw the decibel.
No. We'll find out at the end who we've actually been talking to.
So Dan, did you have a similar sort of thing? Are you political science, or do you come at it from acoustics?
Not even close. Edda and I have converged on working together from very different pathways. I started out as somebody who was always math capable, and I also played instruments for most of my life. Right now I've been playing the piano for about 30 years. And so I went into undergraduate just interested in pursuing math and pursuing music at the same time. And somewhere in, I think, my junior year of undergraduate, I found a course called psychoacoustics, and I tried it out and I really liked it. And I continued working in a lab with the professor from that class. I found a master's in audio engineering, and I started working at a hearing aid company for 4 years. And during my time at the hearing aid company, I remember being really surprised at how much effort went into a technology where you would try to get benefits on the order of like 1 or 2 decibels. That would be considered a huge achievement in terms of success on the hearing aid. But I was always surprised why, you would put on a hearing aid and then go outside, but the outside always sounded so awful. And I wondered why nobody was working on fixing what it sounded like outside, which is how I got into soundscape studies. I found McGill University, and I really clicked with Catherine Guastavino, who we both work with right now. And we've been making a home out of a lab based at McGill, and we've started this partnership called Sounds in the City in the meantime. So that's how I got into this field.
Cool. So I did a little bit of snooping to see what sort of path you'd taken. And am I right that you spent a little bit of time at Stanford in the Center for, what is it, Computing and Music Research, or Computing Research in Music and Acoustics or something like that?
I hope I get the acronym right. CARMA is at Stanford, so that's the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. And that was a nice year of my life, learning about everything about turning sound waves into electronic waves, learning how to mic things, learning a little bit about the technologies and digital signal processing. That was a neat time, and that lab was run by the person who had invented FM synthesis. Not run by, but it was started by the person who had invented FM synthesis. So it was cool that was that center had a history of being a place where audio technologies were emerging from.
Noise.
Noise is just noise.
It's just noise.
your sort of ongoing project, it might have come to an end, but it's been going for quite a while, of Musikiosk. Do you want to tell us a bit about like sort of what it was and what the goals of the project were?
I can start with that question. Musikiosk is a project that went down in 2015, but it has been the gift that keeps on giving for us. Every time we look at this data with a new lens, we keep finding something new from it, and it's become an excellent proof of concept for our work with the city and as a calling card for research when we work with other people. So Musikiosk was conceived of as a musically oriented soundscape intervention where people could show up with their own music playing devices and play whatever content they wanted over high quality-ish speakers in a public space that were installed over a period of a few months. The installation itself was automatically shutting itself down at night. In Montreal, some people might be surprised that nighttime is considered to be quite late there. So at 11 p.m. is when the machine shut itself off, and it would start itself up again in the morning. So people could really use the space in an unsupervised way, but aided by the technology that was put in the space by our team. And so associated with that intervention, we did a research project in a few stages. We did an initial research phase plus an outreach phase to understand what the needs of the community were. We did additional research while the intervention was in place. And of course, we have been doing follow-up research, which involves working with the city in the time since then to help them understand what the effects of our findings were. And since the time that Musikiosk has happened in 2015, we've actually greatly expanded our partnership with the city into other soundscape interventions. So that's been the legacy of that project.
Can you tell us a bit more? Sorry, can you tell us a bit more about the community you were working with? So, was it Edda? Sorry.
I'm just pointing at Edda because I think she'll be the better person to answer this question.
She is.
As a full disclaimer, this is a project that I joined as it was happening. So I joined it as the speaker system was installed in the kiosk in the Portuguese community in Montreal. So that was also my first foray into Montreal. Actually, was that 2015 summer when just came into a new city to have to observe and to see what's happening with this relatively novel soundscape installation. The community that had been engaged before was really the local community of people who lived around the square. So just for a little background, this is what we might call a pocket square. So it's a really small square. It's mostly gray, but there's also some bushes and some trees. And the area of interest is really a gazebo, where a lot of people would seek shelter when it rains or whatever. It's a pretty cute construction, and the square also has a long history of being associated with all sorts of musical events. It's really next to the house of Leonard Cohen. It's on on Saint Laurent, which is one of the busiest and most vibrant streets in Montreal, and it is surrounded by smaller streets. So it's a combination, like the community around it is a combination of business owners, of people who work in different companies or different locations around, as well as the most interesting aspect of it is that this is really in the heart. The park itself is called Parque de Portugal, so that's really a square in the middle of a former, still a Portuguese community. Actually, most of them are Azorean from the islands, from the Azores. So that's where there's a lot of Portuguese elderly people, still some alive from the first wave of migrants from, I think it would be something like the 60s. And that is a place where they congregate. They're the ones who usually occupy half of the square, the half opposite the gazebo. So this is a gazebo where there was a lot of musical events organized. There was all sorts of mini festivals and stuff like that. So it had a very vibrant type of usage, and the people around it in our outreach phase were actually quite encouraging of this idea, as long as we had provided them these limitations that Dan just described, making sure that there is a cap on the limit on how loud the music can go. that it would turn itself off at certain times. And just to add to that, also there were some times of silence on Saturday afternoon, if I'm not mistaken. So there was also this thing of like encouraging moments where there would be no output. But the most fascinating part of it is the fact that because of the morphology of the gazebo and the way in which the speakers were arranged, actually you couldn't really hear it outside. So you could hear it in a small radius around the gazebo, but other than that, you couldn't really hear it. You couldn't even hear it on the opposite end of the square. And this was also a busy street with a lot of car traffic, buses passing and whatnot. So this was, as Dan said, it was really a proof of concept of having a soundscape installation installed in a small square that could really add new types of use and new types of bring in new types of people to the square, but really without disrupting the local community, which is anyway at the center of all of these, sound sources and a very, very vibrant ambiance.
How long was it installed in that particular square? Like, how long did this run there?
The project was in place for about 2 months. And just to give a little bit more of the local context, this is a space undergoing a really slow transformation. So back when this wave of Portuguese immigrants was making this their home, something really cool that they did was they started painting their houses in Azorian colors. But these were houses that were built with French stone. So you have this really beautiful neighborhood that's full of colors and full of beautiful old stones. So it's a very unique look, and you'll only see houses that look like that in Montreal. So very much worth a visit. And at the same time, one of the reasons that they had found that neighborhood was that the housing was quite inexpensive at the time. It also had a history as a red light district, and that was undergoing transformation. Also associated with that low price, it became a bit of an artist community. So there were a ton of bars and local venues in the neighborhood. And as commonly happens in neighborhoods that are inexpensive and have great arts, it began to go through an economic transformation, which has led in the meantime to a lot of noise complaints about the bars and a lot of issues concerning the sound environment of the street, particularly Saint Laurent. So what's been happening is quite a number of these bars have been closing, and people are understandably really concerned about the history and the trajectory of that street. So Musikiosk kind of also was happening at a moment when the city was trying to reckon with what is our musical heritage, what are we going to protect moving forward. And so this was an interesting time for the city to have a conversation about music in public spaces. So another thing that was happening was that at the time, and I think still today, the regulations of that neighborhood said that any amplified music in the public space was illegal, and that you would have to go through a very special exemption through the Parks Department in order to get approval to play any amplified music. And of course, we went through that procedure, and it was very unusual for them to have an intervention that was amplified that would last for 2 months. So they'd never really done that before. Luckily, we had the support of one of the city councilors, and so that was able to move forward in terms of the application. But this was just happening in a moment when that neighborhood had needed to have that discussion. So the Portuguese aspect was another layer on top of that. The musical aspect was a layer on top of that, and the regulations aspect was a layer on top of that.
That's great.
Soundscape and gentrification.
Exactly. Let's gentrify back to Portugal. I had a question specifically about the results from the paper in applied acoustics. So at some point you mentioned that basically, so the intervention significantly increased eventfulness and vibrancy without at the same time decreasing the calmness and appropriateness of the place. So how do you think that was possible, and why that was happening?
I'll start, and maybe Edda can fill in the gaps if I miss anything. So the square itself, it's unusual that we would call it a park, and the morphology that this space really has is along the lines of what we would call a pocket park, which functions a little bit more like a postage stamp in the middle of the city. It's a quick and I'm trying to think of a nice word for it, but it's an expression of the the local culture more so than a space where you would go to read a book under a tree. This is really not that kind of space. So a lot of there's a huge cross section of you could read a book in that park. Actually, it would be pretty nice. But let's say it's a cross section of the neighborhood. You can get nice food. You can have a loud conversation. You can catch your bus. You can do some people watching, which is exactly what the Portuguese immigrants spent a few hours per day doing in that park. And so
it's people complaining mostly.
So the space itself was already quite vibrant and already quite eventful. And what we did was the gazebo itself was almost never being used. So we basically took an underused corner of this already small park and just gave it some animation. And so I think the park didn't have, let's say calm wouldn't be one of its first attributes. But generally what the literature might tell us is that if you add sounds to a place, it's probably going to be less calm. But I don't think that we're changing the character in that dimension by basically reinforcing some of the activities that were already there. And something that we learned from the interviews in the place were that people were really enjoying people watching in that park, and perhaps for some people watching is calming. And so the Musikiosk basically gave something else to people watch, or even something more specific to people watch. And so it sort of blended with the activities that were going on in the space. So the activities themselves that people could watch were more vibrant because it included a musical component. So there was dancing, there was more laughing, there were more spontaneous things going on. But I don't think it had a negative impact on the calmness of the space, which is why we wouldn't have seen any changes in that dimension.
So this is for music in particular, but you also have different studies, different interventional studies. So for example, the Place de Fleurs de Macadam. So in that case, you had a different type of sources like water features. So what kind of differences and how did that play out instead?
Can I take that one? So the complexity of the comparisons is like the differences are massive in terms of type of space, in terms of morphology of space, in terms of amenities provided, and even in terms of the street where it's on. So that also affected the sources that were added with different purposes. Like Musikiosk was really intended to be, maybe Dan didn't make that very clear, but people could really come there and connect their own device to play. So that's something that maybe wasn't specific. So it wasn't designed to be a musical intervention. It was supposed to be a soundscape intervention. The fact that people chose mostly to play music is a very side story. And we have also studied, how people felt about the types of thing that they were playing, because that also is a matter of like performance of self. Like, this is what I'm playing, so I'm honest to the world. I was the one who was always around there and encouraging people to play like the trashiest stuff they would have on their phone, just so they would feel comfortable, because it is a matter of identity. You don't want people to know that you listen to and I was like, you know what? No, I have the entire Britney Spears collection on my phone and I will play it with, just to encourage people.
Is that what you played when you were up there?
It was Britney Spears. I drew the line of Justin Bieber, even though it was in Canada.
Not even a Christina Aguilera song. Nothing.
Yes, Christina Aguilera, and I was sharing that with someone that's where also I discovered the first album of Kendrick Lamar. So there was also a few expletives played too. But no, just to say that this was an installation where people were encouraged to connect their own devices. So. So that was something related to, okay, I'm taking my phone, I'm taking my iPod, whatever was popular in 2015, and then I plug it in, and then I'm playing my music. Whereas what happened in Fleurs de Macadam was something that was really intentional. We had added it. We worked together with an art collective, and then these installations was designed in mind, or were selected in mind, with encouraging what we called in French the vocation of the space. So if this was supposed to be a space that would encourage socialization or socializing, what types of non-musical sounds can we add to do that? So the purpose of it was also an exploration of how can we add sounds that stand out, sounds that blend in the background but still encourage. So that was also a different form of experimentation, whereas this one was really encouraging people to manifest their own identity and just say, okay, guys and ladies and folks, just connect your own device and play whatever you desire. So that was also a big difference. But I would really emphasize also on the types of spaces that these were. Flock de Macadam is an open space. It used to be a parking lot. It used to be a gas station. It basically probably used to be a building that burned down and it was just an empty. Whereas this one is really a designed, classic stamp park from a long time ago. So it has a different morphology. The gazebo is more in the back. And you can't really hear when the speakers were really installed in the ceiling of the gazebo, whereas Flock de Macadam had a network of speakers that were really on the outside. So these were two different forms of experimentation of how we can encourage interaction with sound, but also with the agency of using sound, of selecting sound, and on all these things.
Did you ever have any complaints? Because you've got people who can play their own sounds. You have no control over that. Did you have anyone go, "Oh no, that these people they keep playing this horrible sound over here"?
There's this girl with Britney Spears. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
I know.
Can't get rid of her.
I know. And she
The
doesn't
same
even
woman
speak
shows
French.
up every day and plays Britney Spears.
Exactly.
She doesn't even speak French to us. Jen, I'll take this one just for some small comments, and then you can take the more generic thing. So that was a big concern from the beginning. We actually didn't. There were some complaints from some people, but there were. I think there was one neighbor that complained when we did a follow-up interview. But I think their reasons behind the complaint was the fact that it was bringing in people that she was not necessarily satisfied with. So I think that also brings in the whole conversation of, is it really the sound or is it really who's making the sound? So it's that was an interesting aspect. But other than that, there were not really a lot of complaints. Again, the music couldn't really be heard in the people among the people that lived around. As a very side aspect that I think should be mentioned was the fact that people who didn't really live in the neighborhood were not always comfortable about using the square, because they felt like the square was sometimes being used by homeless people, or like Dan said, that history of it being part of a red light district sort of lingered around the neighborhood. And the fact that you constantly had this community of elderly Portuguese people sort of eyeing you every time you enter the square also made people feel quite alienated in it. So encouraging them to engage it, encouraging people and inviting people to just come to the square and engage with it in a different way also made them feel more, it created new different forms of use of a square that they would otherwise not use. So that was also...
Did Musikiosk improve that aspect of it? Like, were you bringing in more people from outside of that very specific community?
You would be shocked about how shy people are in using a device like that.
Yeah.
So, that's the thing that we were trying. I mean, we also didn't really know from the beginning. We had similar concerns, right? But that's why we had to put all these measures in place to mitigate those concerns, like, volume at a certain level and shutting itself off. But on the other hand, I really people did not. That's why I was playing Britney Spears, because it was such a matter of because it's so uncommon, right? We're thinking of the boom boxes in the 80s where people were just walking down the street and listening to whatever revolutionary music they were listening to. Whereas this is not something that, I think we're socially programmed to not do that anymore, to not occupy the acoustic space. So actually it took sometimes a little bit of convincing to encourage people to use it, simply because it's something that is not common. And especially, again, this was 2015, you had to literally connect it with a jack.
You can't even do that anymore. They've just completely removed it.
I think I bought the last phone that has that generation.
This is the real cause of the replication crisis in acoustics.
That's right.
The fact that the new Google Pixels don't even have a jack anymore.
Yeah, iPhone doesn't have the jack.
Yeah, ours are the last ones that have them, Dan.
Okay.
Yes, we got the same one. The generation afterwards doesn't have it anymore. So those things I think were very also challenged a lot these ideas of, if you let people do it, they're just going to play crazy stuff all day long.
Yeah.
They won't.
You noted in the...
Yeah, I have a... Yeah, sorry, just a technical concern. Didn't it buzz when plugging the jack in?
Bzz.
Bzz. And then plays music. Because, when you plug the cable, it usually...
Bzz.
Yeah.
What devices do you have, Tim? Are they the same devices that you used when you worked for the radio in the 60s?
Yeah.
It was pretty minor, the connecting sound. I think a lot of people just would have their phones on like, I don't think everyone is leaving their phones on maximum volume all
No.
day. So generally they would have to turn up the sound after they had plugged in. So, but funny story about the connection was that originally it was conceived of as being Bluetooth connection only. And I was convinced that in 2015, people were not going to understand how to connect with Bluetooth, or how to, or even like that there wouldn't be a visual component that would help them recognize that this was something that they should be interacting with, because Bluetooth is necessarily something that's not visual, right? So I begged and begged to have them also build an audio jack, and it became such a joke to them that they even called it Dan's Jack for a while. That was like how the diagrams for the device were put together, and it basically became the only way that people connected to it in the end. So
so you did have Bluetooth available. They just
it
didn't.
did also have Bluetooth, but
yeah.
You know, Bluetooth is not a solved technology, and so you try Bluetooth a few times and it doesn't work, and then you just plug into the jack, which always works. So in the end, that was and I think there was something much more tactile about plugging in that made like sharing your music in that public space a little bit more real. And so
And I
I
think
think
Because you see it.
And
Yeah.
people were still a bit meh about like connecting with Bluetooth and feeling like sharing this over the waves would give people access to their phones and stuff like that. So there was a lot of aspect there. Like, I think the jack worked for that.
Now you could manage that probably a bit better. People are more used to using QR codes, particularly for scanning like track and trace stuff now, that you could have a QR code that like automatically, I don't know if that's possible. It feels like it should be possible, automatically connect to the Bluetooth. I wanted to go back actually to something, Edda, you were saying about like people not having the confidence to go up and play this sort of stuff. Something you noted in the paper was that you saw a gender difference between who actually used the system. Does that sort of play into that different groups of people were more or less confident engaging with it?
I think so. I think to an extent. I mean, our study was, of course, preliminary. We weren't there 24/7, so we couldn't see everyone who used it. But there were definitely some differences that we noted in how people were comfortable using their devices, how comfortable they were to connect, and how comfortable they were to play their stuff. And I think that was, as far as I saw it, just like outside of the scientific aspect, there was really just an all-around level of discomfort around people in between like 20 and 40 in sharing their music and appropriating their space. But I feel that definitely women were more, people who identified as women were more attuned to that aspect of like realizing what's happening and like understanding the aspect of acoustic appropriation and understanding, what they would be doing. But yeah, I think that was in terms of the gift that keeps on giving, that was definitely the thing that we didn't even think about when this was designed, of the fact that people did not jump at the opportunity to do this simply because this is not something that we're attuned anymore to occupy our acoustic spaces, not for revolutionary purposes or for spaces of protest or things like that, just to do it for fun. It feels like you're, occupying someone else's space. So that was a lot of reflection on that. Like, I don't want to play something that people would feel that it's offensive. So I'm not going to play heavy metal. As heavy metal was always considered to be like the, the dangerous. So I think the gender aspect was definitely, I feel like the women were the ones who were more reflective on what that happened. But in general, across genders, there was this aspect of like, I want to be respectful. I don't want to push what I'm listening on other people, and we're just not used to doing that anymore. So I think that was the biggest surprise on this with this technology compared to, for example, what we noted in Stanford and Macadam, because when you're giving people the opportunity to do so, even teenagers were not as jumping at the occasion as we had expected them. Again, this was 5-6 years now. Maybe now it would be different. But then it was a bit like, is it for real? Are we going to get busted? Is it something that's going to be, is it going to get us in trouble? Or
did you have any kind of information on site, like printed stuff, like to brief the participants or users?
Yes, and so we originally started with just we started with very minimally, but luckily we had an urban planner who was on the project who was very perceptive in telling us that I don't think people are going to understand what this is. And we were like, what do you mean? It's an audio jack. You plug it in. And she's like, I just really, I don't think people are going to get it. And the more the project went along, the more we realized to what extent we needed to do outreach just to help people understand what the device was and what they could do with it. And even that they had the capacity to plug in their own device to for themselves. So in the end, eventually we had a little poster that had images of a hand plugging in the jack and bilingual instructions and...
my hand, could I add? It was my hand.
And
we had a banner
Jack?
towards the end. We also dance Jack.
Dance Jack, of course.
And we also had a banner towards the end, and we also organized. So we had a Facebook page. This was in the time where a Facebook page was not as politically charged as it is today. We had a Facebook page for the system, and we would organize some events. I think it was Tuesday evenings around 8. We would just encourage people to come and just play their music and sort of like, guilt-free, y'all just come, bring some snacks, or we had like a yarn bombing type of event. We were just encouraging people to come and just with the idea of, at one point it became obvious the word of mouth would be more important than any other type of outreach. So that's what actually made us have a little bit more participants, a little bit more users, was the fact that one person would come, that they would bring their friend, and they would bring their other friend, and then we would just talk there. So it also created a form of engagement with the space and with the people that were around there that was a bit more unique and a bit more social than it would have been before.
And now a greedy question, like how much did it cost, the whole thing? And how much do you think it would cost to sustain it on the long term? Just if you had to pitch it to a local authority, how much would they foresee for budget things? Well,
it depends. Like if we don't include the labor cost, it was pretty inexpensive.
I mean, yeah, slavery apart. Slavery. I mean, if you forget about slavery of researchers and PhD students, like the actual
we're doing
cost.
it out of love anyway.
Yeah, no.
That's what sustains us.
If we simply love the research, then it's a quite inexpensive intervention. I was surprised at the extent to which printing was kind of the majority of our budget.
Wow!
Because once you've bought the speakers and spent some, the interface itself was just using Raspberry Pi, which is super cheap.
Yeah.
The housing was just made out of aluminum, which is super cheap. The city provided us the power cables on a pole that was already there, so that was free. And what we were spending our money on was,
printing surveys.
Printing surveys for people to take, but also like printing the poster, printing the banner to encourage people to come.
That's the
but
environmental tax.
You didn't give us the figure, the number. We need to sell it somewhere else.
$1 million.
Canadian dollars.
Rupees, Canadian rupees.
£2.
So when you finished, did you have anybody from the community who's sort of saying, "Oh, keep it.
Please don't go. Please don't go."
Yeah, we want it back.
Well, it's funny you say that because we still have a lot of people checking the Facebook page, and we have all forgotten the password to be able to take it down. So kind of recently we got some comments of people saying, "This is a terrible idea. Please never do this." And the best we can do is respond as ourselves, like the project is long gone, so don't worry.
I'm sure there are certain things you could post on it that'll get it just automatically taken down.
Well, I was the one managing it, but I don't have Facebook anymore, so the thing is. Yeah. But it was funny because we even on the surveys that we conducted surveys with people that were on the square while this was playing, but they weren't necessarily aware. So we just approached people on the opposite end of the square, and we asked them, like, what would you think about an installation like that? And some people were like, this is a terrible idea. And we were like,
It's there. Hello.
Did they change their minds?
they were like, there were some people who were just like, just any idea would be a terrible idea, but it was fun to be like, and now turn around for surprise 101.
Yeah,
I think that's...
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're good. Go ahead, Dan.
People really warmed up to it. It didn't take much time, and I think because, you know, the music that ended up being shared was music that people were perceiving to be safe to play in the presence of other people. So it actually did really create a very spontaneous community event. The problem is it really, like, I wonder about its self-sustainability, just because it does require word of mouth, and it does require, you know, constant encouragement for people to share those things, which is, again, one of the huge surprises for us. To talk about a little bit what happened, and to return to your question about complaints, I can talk a little bit about what happened a bit during and after the installation itself. So we did reach out to a few of the neighbors, and in the of one of the neighbors, they had recently moved there with their new baby, and they said that all of the music was keeping their baby up and that it was very distressing to them. They were a young couple that had just moved from France, and they were upset at how lively this park was that they were overlooking, maybe not realizing that they had signed a lease to overlook a busy and popular park. But during their interview, they mentioned that that they didn't like the karaoke. And so for a little bit more information on that, this square was also used on a semi-regular basis, not during Musikiosk, for karaoke events that were sponsored by a different organization within the city. And the karaoke events did not do any, let's say, level limiting. So they were playing music very, very loud compared to us. And so I think from the perception of somebody who overlooks the park and doesn't like the park and is not invested enough to go see what's going on, I don't think they could tell the difference between what we were doing and what the city was doing on other basis. So we spoke to a few other neighbors, including, you know, some people who were maybe could be described as being pessimistic, and they didn't love it, but they also didn't hate it. They thought, you know, if I'm going to be overlooking a park, this isn't so bad in terms of an intervention. At the beginning of the project, we had given them our email addresses, we had given them our phone numbers, and said, if anything is going wrong, please let us know, and we can change the specs of this device. And in the end, we never heard from them. Occasionally, they would pass through the park and say hi, and we would ask if everything was okay, and they said, yeah, for sure. One thing that was super interesting, though, was, as Edda mentioned, you know, people there is a local homeless population in this community. There was a nearby shelter and a nearby place where you could get some food. And so occasionally a man would sleep overnight in the gazebo, and we became quite friendly with him, and we showed up one day, and the Musikiosk was broken. And he had actually waited for us to arrive because he knew that we would be showing up eventually to check on it, and said, hey, I just wanted to tell you that there were some guys using it last night, and when the machine shut itself off automatically at 11 o'clock, they thought that they had broken it because they were so drunk that they didn't realize that it was shutting itself off, and that they were trying to fix it, and while they were trying to fix it, they broke it because they couldn't. So don't worry, this wasn't vandalism. I just wanted to stick around to tell you that people were actually concerned that they had done something wrong. And with that kind of feedback, we were very happy to spend the $5 to replace the cable.
That's kind of sweet.
Yeah, really sweet.
And the fun part is that you had this Portuguese people that were always there. So you had the group of ladies and the group of men always sitting on opposite benches, never interacting. And they were there the whole day. And they could not care less about what happened. Like, we tried to engage with them. We tried to dance with them. We tried to, like, have them do surveys. They could not care. They were there at but they didn't even look. Like, that was the aspect of, like, what we delicately called not displacing existing users, these people did not care about what was happening. So obviously it wasn't, it didn't cause them any sort of distress or any sort of issues to the point that it would, they didn't even acknowledge its existence.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned a threshold for the level before, Edda. What was that level?
You've asked her about acoustics things, Francesco. Why would you do
Obviously.
Well, then we'll know.
I'll
Rude.
answer that question in a second. But
I
just
need to
wanted-
create awkward moments, during.
Oh, because I'm the only woman here, so you're like, oh.
I'm patronizing you.
Oh, just to mention, we had also showed up with an iPod preloaded with Portuguese music from different eras and tried playing all of it. And sometimes we would get a head nod, but it was not long lasting. They were there to talk to each other and to people watch. And I think my interpretation of this aspect of the intervention was that they appreciated having something new to people watch, but they were not interested in using it themselves. And so in terms of not displacing existing users, check. For improving their experience in the space,
Who knows?
More things to look at.
Maybe.
yeah. But my serious takeaway from that is I think that they liked having something new to people watch.
Yeah.
But what about the level?
On your question of the sound levels, we had a rule for ourselves that the Musikiosk at its highest level would not be emergent from the traffic noise at 10 meters from the gazebo.
Okay.
Good one.
So is
I
that
could have said
dynamically limited, or did you set like a hard threshold that you determined while you were setting up?
Look at you.
so-
Look at you, reviewer number 2. Tell me.
With the sound level meter always on, monitoring the traffic, all based off noise map.
There are no noise maps in Montreal.
Okay.
But we...
What are?
what do you think this is, Europe? So we had a microphone listening, and people were made aware that there was a microphone taking sound levels and very, very brief recordings just so that we could understand what kind of music people were spontaneously playing. But it wasn't there to record people's voices. But we were checking the sound level of the actually played music. So it wasn't a matter of like where you turn the dial. It was actually like listening to the level of the music that was being played. And so there was a level set on that. And as Edda mentioned, the morphology or the way that the gazebo was shaped meant that it was actually pretty loud inside of the gazebo, and you took a few steps outside of it and you couldn't hear it anymore. So it turns out that wasn't a problem at all. And if you were hearing any aspect of the intervention itself, it's because you were hearing the people that were speaking to each other while using it rather than hearing the music itself.
That was my other question was what sort of like I guess I'm trying to think of the way to phrase it, like an acoustic feedback of you start playing some music and then you get people singing along with it and that makes it louder and all that. Did you have any of that sort of stuff that, you mentioned that it also had karaoke in that square. Did it essentially turn into a karaoke?
It never got so raucous, no. Like, there were some nights we were there and we were maybe singing to NSYNC, but it wasn't really, it never got that crazy, and it was just, at one point it would just be people outside of the gazebo sitting on the steps and just chatting or like maybe laughing. So I think surprisingly or not, the square is not, or the gazebo area, like Dan said, was not necessarily used before. So there was actually not a lot of people that would use that part of the square before to just chill and talk and stuff like that. So even though you might not hear the music inside, there was more usage of that particular area of the square than before, but not at levels that would be problematic. And it was just that people using it for a few hours. And, de facto, the fact that the speaker system would shut off, people would just go home. Sometimes they would chill for another 10, 15 minutes, but then they would just go home. So,
On that note,
why are you a floating head, Tim?
The sensor is not recording my movement anymore, so the smart building.
Like, I feel like I'm
Just
watching the face
shut
from
the
Big
lights
Brother.
Yeah, so this is just the light from my screen, right?
It was in the confession room.
It is truly just a perfect floating head.
So yeah, in this
Good brother.
yeah, eerie atmosphere, I wanted to ask. I mean, in one of the previous episodes, we had Dr. Sarah Payne talking about how to design scales to measure soundscape. And you have now experience of soundscape interventions with very various types of sound sources. So from generic music played by users to something designed exactly for that space. And I was wondering, what is your experience on the scale, on the measurement tool itself? How do responses you usually ask, do those different types of sound sources are they detected properly, or there's a confusion about the questions? And if you understand.
I think I did. So, in terms of using the existing research methods, is what I'm understanding, like the scales that we've been using, the soundscape quality protocol and our appropriateness for activity and all of that. Those have been relatively successful for us, and they've definitely been. They have become very useful tools in us explaining the consequences of the installations in lay people's terms, so we can communicate that back to our partners, and to say, look, even though we're adding sounds, people still evaluate the space as being calm or as being appropriate for what they're doing. So I think that definitely has helped. We are still very much in the process of struggling with the activity aspect per se, like how to qualify activities, how to categorize them, how exactly. So our activity adventure, which I personally have embarked from the beginning of my career in this, as technically working, on the use of spaces, we have not found an answer to that. So we are relying on a combination of open responses, and we have to adjust a lot of things, and there's always new stuff that pop up. But the soundscape quality protocol and especially the activity answers have been anyway useful for us to communicate our findings. But other than that, the other aspects that we're trying to translate into design are still something that we're trying to figure out how best to measure it, how best to quantify it. Because qualitatively, there are a lot of methods to do that, but as you know, they're very time consuming, both for analysis but also for collection. People are not willing to spend half an hour filling in a survey and writing the story of their lives. But also going back on the aspect of adding sounds, for example, in different types of sound sources, that was anyway interesting for us to see whether people would figure out that there was added sounds. And like I said, in Fleur de Macadam, in a few of our temporary installations, people did not realize that something was playing on the background, and the SSQP analysis clearly showed that even though they didn't know there was something playing, they evaluated as calmer or whatever. So those tools have been useful for us so far, but definitely the activity aspect, which is something that we've been pushing for almost a decade now, still remains a very slippery category that we're trying to get a grasp on.
Yeah, that was another thing that you focused a lot on, was the sound sources, right? So as opposed to specifically just like asking people, did you find it calm or vibrant and all of that, the SSQP, you asked them just to freely list their sound sources. One of the things I found interesting was that in the paper that when people identified general traffic noise, they might rate it neutral, maybe unpleasant. But when they identified specific traffic noise sources, then was it just basically always unpleasant if they identified specific types of traffic noise sounds? Is there some sort of relationship there between whether or not you identify the specific sound and how much like semantic meaning that carries?
Right. Well, I think you have an association with the actor that's performing the noise producing activity. So when somebody is honking their horn, you're wondering, why are you being such a child? And like, saying, I'm annoyed, so let me make sure everyone else is annoyed around me. So when somebody writes down that sound source, they're saying that jerk who is honking his horn. And that is obviously reflecting their feeling not only about the sound source, but about the actor who's producing the sound source. So when it's something more like a category, something more categorical like traffic noise, it might not be having a negative impact on you, or you might not have associations with the people who are doing those activities. So that's why we would see that sometimes more in the neutral category.
But if I could just add one small thing to that, I think also this way of the way in which we're trying to ask for people to categorize those sources themselves is also part of our effort to not impose the fact that we know that traffic is going to be annoying, because there is, in what we've also noticed in discussions with people, is that they expect traffic to be in a square like that. Like in the Fleury de Macadam, in Parc de Portugal, these are small squares that are like smack on the people on one of the busiest avenues. It does not come as a surprise for them. They did not come in that square for absolute calm, like Dan said. It's not a big urban park that they've come there for. So for relaxation in that sense of calmness. So I think the fact that we're seeing people, categorizing it also as neutral, also maybe challenges a little bit this idea that people are like, oh, cars suck, I want to hear more birds. Yeah. There are also moments in which you're like, there's cars, but at least it's not driving me insane. And, the orientation of the benches also allows me to whatever. There's something I can look at. There's bushes around. So it's also this multisensory aspect that allows these small squares to also provide some form of relaxation and restoration that comes outside of, it's next to a highway, it's next to a street, so it's going to be a problem. So it's about challenging those things to an extent, not saying that all squares should be next to a busy street. But
no, but all streets should have a square next to them, clearly. That's
yeah. Okay with that.
How did the music kiosk impact that sort of perception of the traffic noise? Did it actually make it more pleasant, or did they just not hear it anymore? Was it just easier to ignore?
Well, yeah, we have a bunch of theories about that we're trying to test with our subsequent work. And I think our best running theory right now is that interventions like Musikiosk and other things that you could play over speakers just help to lightly attract the attention away from the traffic sounds, and allow them to be something more neutral than something that's detracting from your use of the space. So it's a very slight turning of the attention to something else that's happening. Our work in the Fleur de Macadam did not really have any sounds playing that were very loud. Some people didn't even notice it, but it did also, we haven't published on this yet, but we did also see a reduction in the mentions of negative traffic sound sources in that space as well. So we think that that's what's happening. It's definitely not, you have this thing called energetic masking, and that's where if you're sitting next to a fountain, sometimes the fountain is loud enough that you can't hear the traffic anymore. That is almost certainly not what's happening. Unless you were directly underneath the music kiosk, you could definitely still hear what was going on from the traffic. So we know that there has to be an attention component to that somehow.
Guys, I have a last question because I think we should wrap this up. Right?
Yeah.
So
it's super interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. So the reason I really, really like the work you people do at McGill is that you are very focused on intervention studies. And this is something that people in the soundscape community are always talking about, like, we need more intervention studies, we need this kind of empirical data to show evidence or whatever. So if you had to advise someone starting a soundscape design intervention right now, so what's your list of do's and don'ts, your tips for people out there to set up their new experiment in the public space?
This was actually something I wanted to mention when Tin asked his question a minute ago, and that's that things like the SSQP, the Soundscape Quality Protocol, aren't really meant to be measuring interventions, because you need quite a significant change to change a 2 to a 3. And so we got quite lucky that we were able to see significant changes across 8 adjectives. Like, these adjectives are assuming that the soundscape is something and not that you're experiencing it a certain way. So I think that we need to shift our attention, not in the same way that the traffic, not in the same way that Musikiosk shifts your attention away from the traffic noise, but we should shift our attention toward understanding like what is the intervention for and what is its goal, not in terms of changing the adjectives of the park, but in terms of changing the experience of the users. And something that I've been really interested in is it's quite common to spend arts budgets on things like sculptures and other permanent visual arts installations if you're doing large real estate projects. But I would really like to see something like budgets for sound art as well. And so that would, to me, give artists the resources they would need to actually work with people like us to change the sounds of the public space for some interesting interventions. That didn't quite answer your questions about.
It's okay, don't worry.
But
I could add to that, to what Dan just said, is indeed we were lucky with noticing these changes, but they have been useful for us in order to justify the need for these interventions and to show the fact that actually, contrary to some expectations and what Dan referred to, like if you're adding more sounds, it's going to be louder. So how can people refer to? So it did at least give us an opportunity to show the fact that in certain situations it didn't even change, right? That it didn't make things more
Worse.
or less of this or that or worse, whatever that means for the people to experience. But what we have noticed in, for example, in the Fleur de Macadam or in other forms of experimentation is that we could really use the sound installation, for example, together with the physical design of a square or of a space or whatever, and use that, bring it together and have people work together in different aspects in order to encourage the purpose of a space. So then if you're trying to design or redevelop a space with the intention of it being used X, Y, and Z, which is something that is already being done in the built environment field, people think of activity, they think of use, but then adding this layer of potentially enhancing or reinforcing or encouraging that type of use or those types of purposes with the help of what would probably be not very high cost, but innovative and pretty cool sound installations or awareness to sound, or God knows what it could be. It could be encouraging people to play their own music. It could be working with an artist that could develop an installation that will allow people to create their own stuff. It could be these creative strategies. It could be also adding sounds to the square. But the purpose of all of our proofs of concepts is to show that if you take this, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but if you take this integrated approach and you're saying, here is the physical form and add some sounds, but not with the purpose of covering. It's not the purpose of not hearing the traffic. That's not the point. It's just going to have, and that's when Dan's focus on experience comes in. You're just saying, how can we make sure that their experience is a bit more adequate for what they would expect from a square that is supposedly for recreation or that is supposedly for chilling for 10 minutes while you're waiting for your bus. So I think changing that lens, I think all of our projects are pointing in that direction. Our measurements that, from the soundscape field are showing that, at best, we're not causing any damage. And really, at the best, we're actually providing innovative experiences. We're making people think of things in a different way, and we're just making them have an even nicer experience of the square, which they haven't had so far. And that is not that expensive. It doesn't require that much cost. And once we're getting it part of our everyday form of engaging with the space, or we're designing infrastructures for that. It will definitely not be something so crazy to ask for, like Dan said, to add a budget for sound art rather than physical art.
Soundscape is cheap. Go for it.
Yeah.
it saves
Cheaper
money.
than
It's
noise
not just-
control.
Yeah.
So where is that taking you now? What are you guys moving on to? Are you continuing the Musikiosk project, or do you have some new projects that you're looking at doing?
Okay, we're gonna be.
Are you allowed to talk about them?
Well, we actually. I'm going to. Dan's going to talk a little bit maybe about Fleur de Macadam, but I'm also going to introduce to the world the fact that we are starting a collaboration with the City of Montreal, with the Department of Economic Development, specifically on nightlife. So we will be, both Dan and I will be working together with the city and with their new city life and noise night and life and noise person, to try and have some policy pilots as well as some public space pilots where we can really see how we can use sound in relation to nightlife. But that's so where it's taking us is it's taking us in a way of experimenting even more and seeing how we can influence not just design strategies, but maybe like a little bit of policy. How can we shift the approach and the understanding of sound and noise in policy, as well as seeing how we can tackle this highly controversial topic of night noise. So we're definitely on the path of more innovative, more pilots. Let's not overuse that word. But just to say that we're now slowly moving, or for our next stop is nightlife.
Yeah. Luckily, it sounds cuter in French because night and noise rhyme in French. So the whole department is like
Nuit bruit.
Nuit bruit, exactly.
But
Nice.
to emphasize what Edda just said, I think a part of the process is that we'll be focusing on is documenting these pilot projects as well, including this Fleur de Macadam project. We have a few different aims for why we're documenting these projects. We know that right now,
Besides our ResearchGate score.
besides our research, there are no advocates for the sounds of public spaces. Rules and regulations don't really cover public spaces. If you want to make a noise complaint, you have to do it from inside of your home, or else it doesn't count. And you really don't have many people that are trying to promote the soundscape, or promote sound art in any way through any formal channels. So we're trying to document how that could become a possibility. And I think also through this documentation, we can help reduce the fear or the concerns, especially of designers and planners, that more sound is going to be bad for us. While, on average that might be true, we definitely think that there are ways to use design to help you with your planning and design goals, and not just to put them at risk. And so projects like the Musikiosk, that was kind of our first opportunity to do that. But we will slowly be coming out with more documentation that is showing an evolution of that thought process. And we want to pose that as kind of a counter to this whole literature that says that noise and more noise is bad. And so we say, well, yes, it can be bad, but if you design it, then it can be good.
And just to add to that, to add also to this idea that noise is bad, is we're also very much active in Montreal's Quartier de Spectacle, which is a festival neighborhood where before 2020, there were a lot of festivals happening. It was a festival season that was year long, with like 6 months of really intense, massive festivals, the biggest jazz festival in the world. And but it is a neighborhood that brings in also people who work, there are residents there. So that's another type of, if you want a proof of concept, but at a much larger scale of a situation in which festival noise is not a problem. People who live there know that, of course, there's complaints, of course, there's issues, of course, there's challenges, but it's challenging these preconceived ideas of sound and noise. And also, to use a term from French that we really love, is the term of vulgarization. So that's something we're engaging a lot in, which basically means, creating more sound awareness and simplifying and translating what we're collecting to the broader public, policymakers and all sorts of city makers and decision makers, as well as like designers. And so these are sort of our three categories. But the bottom line is that we're trying to say is that we know sound is complicated, acoustics is complicated, but there's so many other things outside of acoustics. And there's a lot of things, and there's a lot of people who can engage. I'm sorry to cover your ears.
Citation
problem.
needed.
It just makes
needed.
it more complicated, though.
No, but we're basically just saying, hey, there's a lot of stuff you're already thinking of for everyone that we're talking to. You're thinking about these things already. You don't consciously realize the acoustic implications of all these things, and we're showing them some example of things that maybe go against some preconceived ideas, but then again, they make sense. No one is shocked when we tell them, hey, people didn't really mind that they would listen to music rather than, it's everything. I think you've all noticed that when you're talking about sound, it's a bit of like, but I guess it makes sense. right? There's always these. So I think that's what we're really trying to do with everything that we're engaging in, is to make sure that we're also translating it and vulgarizing it for different audiences, just to be like, hey, this is stuff that you already feel, you're experiencing it. There's a situation where you have to hire or you have to work with people that are outside of this, that are, professionals on acoustics or whatever, psychoacoustics. But on the other hand, there's a lot of things that you can think of already yourself and save yourself a lot of money and headaches down the road.
It's the lovely thing about talking about sound with non-sound people, because everybody experiences it, everybody knows what it is, but they rarely ever think about it.
Right.
So but then, as soon as you mention it, people are just like, oh my God, that's so, I did experience that yesterday. Yeah. That's cool.
And they all hate you for a week because you make them, and then after a week they're done. But it's still, I think that's the advantage of everything that we do, is that once we separate it a little bit from the mathematics of it, I'm sorry guys, you can really, it's an easy thing to talk about, but it's because it's so difficult to formalize it in design recommendations and policy, whatever. So that's what we're really trying to figure out, how to make that process happen.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for coming to our TED Talk.
Thank you for saving the TED Talk for our podcast. That's obviously the best part of this.
It's cheaper to have external editors.
So thank you so much for coming on. It was a wonderful discussion. The Musikiosk project was super exciting. Just to close out, obviously you have a Facebook page, which is very well moderated and everybody should go and leave comments on. Other than that, where should people find you? Is there somewhere you'd like to point them to, a Twitter or anything like that?
Well, we have a few resources. The best that I can mention is our Sounds in the City website, sounds-in-the-city.org. Don't ask.
Now say it backward.
.org.
GRO. So we do maintain a blog. We do post free versions of all of our publications as they come out. We do curate that website. If you're looking for me, you can find me on LinkedIn or ResearchGate. I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone who's listening.
I'm the same, ResearchGate and LinkedIn, and I also have a temporary webpage that has been created for 2 years, and it's eddabild.com, if I'm not mistaken. And you can also find online videos of me talking in Dutch, which are completely traumatic. But yeah, our Sounds in the City group also has a Twitter account, so you can follow us over there too. So everything is bilingual. It Sounds in the City or Ville Sonore. You will find us under both hashtags, I guess. But ResearchGate is where no hashtags.
Our Twitter @ is Ville Sonore.
Ville Sonore.
Oh, I can definitely spell that right now. That's going directly into my notes. I'm not going to have to look it up afterwards. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a lovely pleasure to have you guys here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And cut.
Thank you.
And bye.
Guys, it was great. I have
The rest is just noise. Yeah, make sure to save all your recordings. Noise.
Noise is just noise.
It's just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.